Do you struggle to 1, get in front of high-level decision makers in business, and then 2, to get what you want from those meetings? Then this episode is for you. Hello, Sales Nation, and welcome to today's episode of the Salesman podcast. On today's show, we have Jim Ninivaggi. He is the SVP of Business Development over at Brainshark.com. And on today's episode, we're diving into selling to the C-suite, how long your meetings should be, what you should be saying in those meetings, how you follow up, a real step-by-step practical guide to selling to the C-suite. And so with all that said, let's jump in to today's episode. Jim, welcome to the Salesman podcast.
Will, it is great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
You're more than welcome, sir. I'm glad to dive in on this topic today I think it's going to be real valuable to perhaps not all of the audience, but a whole chunk of the audience right now. And then as I see sales changing, as I see the more transactional sales roles disappearing, I think this is going to be more and more important to, and you can tell me your thoughts on this perhaps in a minute, but I think this is going to be more and more important to more and more salespeople as time goes on, as sales gets more complex, more decision makers, you're dealing on higher levels within the organization and having high level conversations. So of course, we're going to be talking about selling to the C-suite. But before we get into all of that, how do we know, and just turn it on its head slightly, how do we know whether we should be selling to the C-suite? How do we know whether they're the people that we should be approaching, or we should be dealing with people perhaps further down the food chain?
That's a perfect question, because every company I've ever worked for, any company I've ever worked with, you're always told sell higher, right? And in some cases, yeah, you should. And in some cases, the C-suite's not going to be involved in every decision process. If I'm selling paper, copier paper, that's probably not going to be on the agenda of the C-suite. So I think the first thing you need to understand is the buying process. Who's involved? When are they involved? At what level, how high in an organization will this decision go? Some of that's going to be determined on the size of the company you're dealing with. If I'm selling into the small or mid-sized businesses, that decision, even if it's a $30,000 decision, might go to the president or C-suite level. Whereas if I'm calling on a Fortune 500 company, that might be at a lower level. So the first thing you want to understand is the buying process and really how high in the organization a typical decision goes.
So I want to jump in here because I don't want to gloss over this, because I think this is it's one thing to say that, but I want to fill in perhaps some of the how, because clearly we all know we should all know who we should be targeting. But is this experience? Is this using our guts? Is this asking someone within the organization and finding that influencer perhaps, or there's different terminology to describe that individual? How would you, Jim, go about finding out whether we should be dealing with the C-suite and uncovering their buying process?
It's a combination of experience and doing a review of your won-loss deals and really understanding at various points in that decision process who was involved, what role did they play, and what was the outcome. The second is, you ask. Tell me, and not every buyer is going to be upfront and give you let me explain exactly how this is going to happen. But you have to ask, and then you ask again, and you ask again. Because as the decision is being made, in some cases, the buyer is really understanding their own decision process for the first time. So you have to ask not just once, you have to keep asking throughout the sales process. But it's a combination of experience, learning from your fellow salespeople, and also asking that buyer, tell me about your buying process.
So this is something that I wanted to double down on. You mentioned it twice there. Is it our buying process that we're slotting the individual into, and we're trying to, I hate this term, but essentially we're trying to force them down this funnel that we have? Or are we truly, genuinely trying to uncover what their buying process is and then align what we're doing with them?
Yeah, this is something that I was an analyst in a previous life, and I did a lot of work in this area of it's the latter. It's as much as we in sales love to think that we're in control, and that's why we have a sales process, right? We have this, the buyer has their own decision process. And yes, we can influence that decision process. But the reality is, in most cases, we're following that decision process. When I hear a sales VP say, my biggest problem is I need to accelerate the sales cycle. I'll just make it a day. If it was up to us, every sales cycle would be a day long. But the reality is, that's not how companies make decisions. So it's understanding that decision process, and then understanding, again, who's coming and going throughout that process, what roles are coming and going, and what does the buyer need at those various critical components in the decision process. That can help us accelerate the time to decision. But when I was a sales VP, I didn't ask my salespeople, when are you going to close this deal? Like as if you had that magic wand, I'll close it on Tuesday. I would ask the question, when is the buyer going to make a decision? Why do you think why do they need to? I know why you need them to make a decision by September 30th. Why do they need to make a decision by September 30th? And it's understanding, it's taking that outside in view, which I think is absolutely critical in understanding how to sell throughout that decision process.
How do we implement that? Because that seems like the sensible option. It seems there's no counterintuitiveness to it. It seems like if you're going to have happy customers for a long period of time, then perhaps at some points you need to give them a bit of a nudge. You need to get them over a hump of being fearful or not understanding the risk and getting the benefits and the rewards of the deal in place, and you can talk them through that. But other than that, it seems like we're giving up our power a little bit. Is there, and taking into consideration, I'm sure from background as an analyst and the conversation we've had so far before we click record, you seem somewhat data driven with a lot of this. So if we just take off the table that there's any other solutions, that this is the correct way to go about it, how do we implement this, and what do we say to our SVP of sales, VP of sales, when they say, from the B2B salesperson's perspective, when they say, I need you to close 4 deals by the end of the month, and you turn around and say, well, they're just organically not ready yet. How do we get over that hump?
The light bulb went off for me sitting across from a sales VP who was stating, my biggest problem is our sales cycle has gotten longer. It used to be 6 months and now it's 9 months. And I think my salespeople need closing skills, right? The classic, right? They're not asking for the business. And, that's the light bulb went off for me because he was asking the wrong question. The question wasn't, why was the sales cycle getting longer? The question he should have been asking is, why is the decision process taking longer? Why is it taking our buyers longer to make a decision, 9 months to make a decision as opposed to 6 months? Because, I can tell you, salespeople generally don't have an incentive for elongating the sales cycle. And so it's understanding that. And that's the question we started to ask with the sales VP. And when we did an analysis of their current pipeline of deals, we looked at where they were getting stuck at the latter part of the decision process. And this was in about 2007, 2008. And we all know what was happening in 2008. The economy was really shaky, right? And obviously buyers were a lot more cautious. And so I said, look, what you've got to focus on is not closing skills. It's you've got to somehow, when the buyer gets to that point in the decision where they're either going to go yes or no, you need to provide them with all the proof that they need in order to move, to remove as much risk as you can away from spending this money, and showing them why spending this money now, even in a shaky economy, is going to help their company save money or accelerate revenue. And it's having that, as opposed to the typical knee-jerk reaction, which is, we'll just get the salespeople to close faster. We'll give them closing skills. Mm-hmm. It's taking, I think, a more thoughtful approach, understanding where those roadblocks are happening in the decision process, and then providing to your salespeople the tools, the data, the skills that they need in order to, remove those roadblocks for the buyer so that they can make that decision.
And the reason I ask you this, Jim, and I'll drag things back over to the C-suite and the main crux of the conversation in a second. But the reason I ask you is because I see this from the audience. I get a lot of people email me saying, as you were just described, it used to be that I'd close deals in 6 months. Now it's 9 months. And there's as they write that, I can see them thinking, well, it's probably because the pipeline isn't full enough that it's a problem. Because if you've got 100 people in your pipeline and it takes 9 months versus 6 months, it doesn't really matter as long as there might be a 3-month period of drought, but once it gets back in sync, you're still going to close the same amount of deals per month. So I can feel that they're typing this and having this realization at the same time. But I wanted to just dive into it a bit deeper because I often get asked from the audience, as you get kind of, as you mentioned then in your anecdotes about the VP of sales, I get people asking me for more podcasts on closing techniques and essentially weird manipulation tactics. And I've only ever done one show on closing techniques. And the outcome of the show is essentially you just ask a question along the lines of, are you ready to move forward with this? If you've done all the other steps, in the B2B world, on these complex sales, if you've done all the other steps, it should be a yes or no answer. You solve the no, and then you move to the yes, and you just keep going down that line. There's no weird pressure. There's no twisting people's arms. There's no, which tell me, and I'll judge on your face whether this is a good technique or a bad technique, but there's no giving huge discounts just to close the deal at the end of the month.
Absolutely. I sold, before I was an analyst, I sold sales training. I worked for what used to be part of Xerox. It was Xerox Learning Systems. And, I talking to a VP of sales, my problem is my reps don't ask for the business. They're not closing. We need closing skills. And I'd say, okay, let's explore that a little bit more. And, I'd start asking questions around, well, tell me about what's happening throughout the sales process. And, are your salespeople able to uncover needs and create urgency? And ultimately, what we would find is it wasn't a closing skills problem. It was a selling problem, right? If I've not done a good job of creating urgency and need, then I have to create an artificial close. And to your point, Will, if I've done a really good job of throughout that conversation, throughout that sales process, the close just naturally happens. And all we're doing is, we're just summarizing what we've already agreed upon. And we're looking to move forward and with appropriate next steps. But yeah, I've never been a big fan of the Franklin close or the trial close, or, I think that if you're doing your job as a good consultative salesperson, the close will happen. You still need to ask for the business, to your point. You still need to, summarize, here's what we've agreed upon, here are the next steps. The other thing, a close that drives me crazy is when a salesperson says, what do you think the next step should be? You should know as a salesperson walking in what you want to get out of that meeting, and you should be proposing the next steps, mutual next steps with that buyer. And then, getting their feedback. And maybe the buyer will say, well, I'm not quite ready for that, but I am ready for this, right? That's fine, right? But the salesperson should be, based on everything that they've learned throughout the sales process, throughout that conversation, they should be proposing the mutual next steps that should be taken.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it seems, and in the dealings that I'm doing with HubSpot, Salesforce, these huge companies at the moment, I just put a deal together that in my own mind, I imagine the person reading the email or having the conversation, being on the other end of it, and they go, oh, it would be stupid not to do this. And I'm happy to, and this is slightly different perhaps in that I've got more opportunity to price things, angle things, add extra value versus perhaps someone who's in a corporate sales role. So I appreciate that. But I always just try and leave that little bit extra on the bone. I try and make it, the classic Gary Vaynerchuk kind of slogan of giving 51% and only taking 49. That's how I approach all this. And it reduces my stress levels massively because I know when I put a proposal together, 9 times out of 10, it's going to get accepted without question. And it just makes my life easier and simpler. And I'm doing bigger deals, less of them, with less stress and more profitable deals. And so I don't understand the need and the imperative for anyone to be twisting people's arms or doing weird tactical stuff when this option's on the table. So all that one side, and that slight rant about closing them, because I've just, as I said, I've answered a few emails this morning about that, and I'll push people towards this show when it comes out. Going back to the C-suite. So I don't really want to cover how to get in front of them because clearly that's a whole conversation in itself. I really want to deal with how we show up in front of them. Do we have to prepare differently to speak to the C-suite versus speaking to an end user or a meeting with middle management? Do we have to do we have to arrive either looking differently, having prepared differently, or with a different message?
Absolutely. This is a case where, again, going back to my sales training days, we were advocating that, you want to ask questions, you want to have the buyer doing more talking. When you're meeting for the first time with a C-level executive, you really first have to earn the right to have a conversation. So you need to demonstrate very early that you've done your homework, that you understand their business, that you understand their issues and challenges. And so the dynamics are, I would advocate that in that early conversation, you actually want to start with a presentation. And you want to demonstrate, hey, I understand your business. I understand where you're going with your organization. I understand some of the challenges that you're having. And here's how my organization, at a very high level, can help you address those challenges. Because if you haven't earned that right, if I'm sitting across from a C-level executive, if I haven't demonstrated that I know their business, then they have no reason to engage with me, because they don't know whether or not I know what I'm talking about, or whether I have something that is relevant to them.
What does that look like from a real practical standpoint of either, we can use Brainshark, the company you work for, as an example, perhaps. What would it? Let's do it both ways. I think this would be interesting to go both sides of the tale. What would you expect someone to do if they were selling to you and the C-suite at Brainshark? And then perhaps we can turn that on its head. And what would you do if you were selling Brainshark to a C-suite as well?
So first, what I expect is somebody who walks in and is going to walk me through at a high level. I don't want we're not talking about an hour-long presentation, but a 10 to 15-minute presentation on summarizing that they understand our business.
And what does that look like? I just want to drill in down to as many details as what we can get. What if I was selling to you? What would you expect me to know, perhaps, about Brainshark?
First thing I would, and it would be, this could easily be either a whiteboard that you're doing, or a very minimalist
I feel
PowerPoint.
you're emphasizing minimal there.
But seriously, 3-4 bullet points with, it really has to come. This is where, the content has to come from within. But what I would expect you to do is say, well, I've done a little bit of homework on Brainshark. Here's my understanding of your business. So just describing, my understanding is Brainshark is a SaaS-based solution designed to you're focused on sales readiness, and you do 3 key things. You help organizations create content, deliver that content to their salespeople, and then assess them for their readiness. And then I would expect you to say, here's my understanding of your objectives. My understanding is that your organization is going through a transformation, where blah, 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 blah. And you're looking to go into these markets, and you're looking to grow by continually innovating your solution. Do I have that correct? And what I would expect you to do is not walk in and like a McKinsey consultant and tell me, but confirm. Do I have this right? Is there anything that I'm missing? And then I would expect you to say, now my understanding is here are some of those issues. Here are some issues and challenges that you're having in being able to hit your objectives. It's the ability to scale quickly enough. Changing compensation, blah blah blah. Do I have that correct? Great. And so here, my solution, the Salesman podcast can help you in these ways. We provide expertise, blah blah blah. And I think that there's a business fit for our organizations to work together. I'd love to have a deeper conversation to really understand how we might be of help. So that you're basically, if having done that, you've done a couple of things. First, and you don't. I always used to say, you don't have to be perfect, and you don't have to get it right. You just have to demonstrate that you've tried, right? And then that C-suite, I think you'll get, especially because it's something that a lot of salespeople don't do, surprisingly. You'll get a lot of credit just for trying and demonstrating that you've tried to do your homework. The second thing is, it's now you've elevated this conversation to a business level, right? And you've demonstrated that, hey, I understand your business, and I'm here to help you run a better business. And at the C level, That's what they care about. To a certain extent, dealing with C-level executives, their issues and challenges are pretty. It's help show me how you can either save me money, or show me how you can I can make more money, or show me how I can minimize risk. Right? Those are the three big things that are on the mind of a C-level executive. That's the answer to your first question. In regards how you could use Brainshark, the beauty of Brainshark is it allows you to show up before you've shown up. So part of our solution allows the salesperson to take a PowerPoint presentation and to add their voice to it. And so I could actually send that presentation to you ahead of time so that when we actually sit down, we're already past that earning the credibility stage. And actually, I can use that presentation to your point to gain the audience. Here's why spending a half hour with me is going to be a great use of your time. Well, my understanding of blah blah blah. So with Brainshark, a couple of things. I can create that content. I can animate it and bring it to life with my own voice. And then when I send it to you, I can actually track whether or not you opened it, and I can track how long you spent on each slide. So I know walking in, Will looked at the first slide, didn't look at the second or third slide, looked at the last slide. And therefore, when I come in, I'm better prepared, and I know what content that I might want to review with you based on what you viewed. So that's how you would use Brainshark to actually probably get that audience.
Going into the insights here that we're going to be sharing with a presentation, with writing on a whiteboard, which I think is that if you can do that well, that probably spanks a presentation and is far more of a useful tool. And maybe we can touch on that towards the end of the show, because I think there'd be value in that conversation. But are the insights that we're trying to give the C-suite at this moment, because I guess we're just trying to build rapport, trust, credibility, as opposed to blow them away with how special and incredible we are, or our product is. No matter, I think most salespeople assume that they're special and incredible, but the C-suite probably drops you a couple of pegs below what you're what you think you are as you sit down with them in their own minds. And we can talk about confidence in a second, perhaps, on that perspective. But are we looking to, with these initial insights, blow them away with, we think that you should do this, this, and this, and there's an opportunity for this, and this competitor is going to come in and take this big chunk out of you? Or are we looking to just set the scene and have a slow build up to perhaps those insights that come later on?
Well, ideally, if you have insights, you should share them early. I mean, and there's no better way to create credibility than to demonstrate not only do I understand your business, but let me share something with you that maybe you don't know, right? So if I have insights that I can share because I work with, your others in your industry, and if I could share something about your competitors that maybe you're not, I'm not talking about trade secrets, but general industry trends, that's a great way to build credibility. And if you can do that, great. Insights are a terrific way to sell. The challenge is it's not always easy to get those insights. I think that conceptually it sounds great. Teach the buyer something that they don't already know. That's very difficult to do. And I think companies who've implemented these insight-centric approaches to selling are finding that that's very difficult to do. So even if you can't do that, that ability to just build that credibility, again, just showing that you've done that homework, because let's face it, a lot of salespeople just they're not good. I mean, I'm sure you get called on by a lot of salespeople. I get called on by a lot of salespeople. And I'd say probably 90% of them, it's clear that they've done either no research or cursory research. So I actually took a call yesterday with somebody who demonstrated that they tried. So just that, that just demonstrating that you have, you've taken the time, that you value their time, so that you invested time to be prepared, that just puts you head and shoulders above the other salespeople that might be trying to get the attention of that C-level executive.
Makes total sense. Okay, so we are either going through our presentation or we're just shaking hands before we do it. I kind of touched on it then, and we'll I don't want to gloss over it, but I don't want to spend a load of time on it. how should we be acting in front of the C-suite? So you mentioned the phrase risk averse or reducing their losses previously as something that we should be focused on. And clearly, I hope that the audience know the answer to this before I say it. But should we be going in there all guns blazing and this cocky, confident salesperson who's going to change the world? Or do we need to be slightly more conservative with the C-suites than perhaps we would be with the end user of the product?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. It's great salespeople are empathetic naturally. They adjust their communication style based on the verbals and nonverbal cues they're getting from the person sitting across from them. So I wouldn't say, it's not going to be one size fits all that, every C-level, every CEO is a hard charging, we create these stereotypes in our heads. I've certainly called on CEOs that were very risk adverse, or who needed more data. I've sat across from C-level executives who needed that personal connection. They wanted to talk more. They said so you start talking about your trip to Italy or whatever. And then there are those C-level executives that have that they're hype power. They're going to try to take charge, and you got to adjust your communication style accordingly. So I would say first try to pick up who are they, and what kind of communication style do you need to match to. But you need to you want to show up to this buttoned up, professional. You want to keep that conversation at that business level. As much as we might be, we're all in love with our product. This is not the time to wow them with, let me show you the mobile version of Brainshark. It's amazing. This is the time to have that. Let me talk about how we can create a business partnership here and how Brainshark can help you run a better business.
Makes total sense. Okay. So this is, I think everything that we talked about so far is not necessarily obvious, but I think it makes sense. And that someone who's never sold to the C-suite, with a reminder of this conversation so far, I think they'd probably do a pretty good job, and they wouldn't, unless they're a complete idiot, they wouldn't go too far off the beaten track with this. But the next step here fascinates me, because this is perhaps the differentiator between someone who gets in the door, does a presentation, and then doesn't get anywhere, versus those that then perhaps get passed down to decision makers down from the C-suite that can make things happen. Then it gets passed up to the C-suite for a final decision. So what do we do after the presentation? I think you used the words, we have a deeper conversation with them. Is this, we set a meeting for an hour, we do a 15-minute presentation, and then we chat for 45 minutes? Is it we come back the next day? How do we frame up this deeper conversation, and what's the goal of the first deeper conversation that we have?
Yeah, so the goal, so that's, you want to walk in with a clear objective, right? And the objective might simply be, you want to be able to have ongoing access to the C-level executive, even though the decision may be still being done by folks at a mid-management level. At a minimal, you want to earn the right to have a subsequent meeting, and it might be, I'd love to come back in 6 months and talk about the value that Brainshark has brought to your team. So it's important to know what that objective is walking in in the meeting. You have to have. You do want to transition into more of a dialogue and a conversation. And this is not a let me talk at you for an hour. So you have to have a couple of really good questions, lined up in order to create that, to kick off that conversation. And I'll share a story. I used to coach salespeople on calling on C-level executives. I was working for a manufacturer of truck tires, and working with their strategic account team. And so, companies like UPS and FedEx and DHL, Walmart, any trucking company, their costs go labor, fuel, and tires. And so it's not, and typically getting to the CEO of a UPS, for example, was very difficult, because the CEO of UPS wasn't going to meet with a tire salesperson, right? And so I worked with this rep for about 8 months and prepping him in getting ready for that C-level conversation, helping him gain access to the CEO, and then actually coaching him on how the call was going to go. And his goal was simply to get on the preferred vendor list for UPS. And he was able to do so by talking about, at that point, UPS was they were going through a transformation, and they didn't want to be known as a shipping company. They wanted to be known as a logistics company. And so this salesperson was able to demonstrate how the cost savings from what their company could provide could actually help this organization in achieving that transformation that they were going after. So he was able to make that connection. And in doing so, he was able to get the approval in that meeting from the CEO he was able to get on the preferred vendor list. And I'll never forget, because I was, as the coach, I was waiting for his call. I knew what time the meeting was. And so I'm like, I felt like a nervous parent. And he called me from the parking lot of the customer. He goes, "Oh my gosh, it went amazing. It was so fantastic. And we got on the preferred vendor list. I can't believe it." And the CEO said, "I wish my own employees understood our business as well as you do." And I thought, wow, that is like the ultimate compliment you can get. So I think it's you start off with that first 15 minutes. You earn the right to have that conversation, and then you have those 2 or 3, really good open probes, and that leads to the rest of the conversation that you're going to have.
So I'm going back to this scenario in a minute, this anecdote, because I enjoy that. But just before that, how long should a meeting with a C-suite exec or a C-suite team last? Should we be trying to book an hour meeting, or are we more likely to book a 30-minute meeting, but perhaps we're going to need multiple of them?
Yeah, I think you start with 30 minutes. I think what my experience has been, they will give you 30 minutes on their calendar. And then if you're good, that 30 minutes will actually turn into an hour. So that will happen if they're not, booked immediately afterwards. But I think the initial meeting, you go for an hour if you can. You ask for an hour. If you can't get an hour, ask for a half an hour.
So, going back to this anecdote you just give us of this champion crushing it and getting on the approved vendor list, which is something that I did regularly in medical device sales. The first hurdle to a lot of the business that we did would be getting on within an NHS trust in the UK, getting on the approved vendor list, and then obviously getting the deals after the fact. And there'd be a lot of residual business that would come in from that as well. So it was always a great place to start, knowing that even if you didn't close that big deal in the moment with the C-suite executive, there's probably downflow business that will come from it over the years to move forward. But what do we do in that meeting when the C-suite executive says, right, I'm going to get you on the approved vendor list? How do we follow up with them to make sure it happens? Clearly, they're busy. They've got lots of things going on. Do we follow up with them directly, or do we say to whoever manages that list, if it's a procurement team, for example, do we then go to the procurement team and say, hey, I've just had this meeting. Here are essentially the somewhat of the minutes from the meeting. Here's what was promised from your side. What do I need to do on my side? How do we solidify this sentence that someone said into an actionable event?
What happened with this salesperson was he looked for guidance from the CEO. So he asked, that is amazing. How do we make that happen? And he used those words. How do we make that happen? And so there you'll get the guidance. So either the CEO will say, well, I will, follow up on our end, and I'll put everything in motion on our end, or they'll basically delegate back to you, the salesperson. And then it's really important for our salesperson at that point then to say, okay, how I want to make sure that it's clear that this is coming from you, not me. What can I get? Can I get an email from you that I could forward to your procurement team that puts this in motion? But look for guidance from the C-level executive, but don't be afraid to push to make sure that you don't squander that opportunity to get that senior level sponsorship.
Good stuff. And final thing, and we'll wrap up with this, Jim. How do we go about following up after the fact? So they've made this promise, they've fulfilled the promise, we're on the approved procurement list. And I'm going to ask you a loaded question here, but do we send them an email every 6 months saying, hey, just checking in. Is there anything else I can do to help? Discussed an email like that? Or do we never deal with them again because we've got what we need from them? Or do we attempt to stay top of mind over the the coming months and years?
You ask. It's very, very important that you ask for continuous access. So you say, I'd love to be able to, I'm glad that you found value out of this meeting. We value this partnership. I'd love to be able to have, on a regular basis, the opportunity to engage with you. How often, 3 months, every 6 months, you ask, but you set the stage. You need to set the stage for that continued access in that first meeting. And then you need to be politely persistent, and you don't stop doing your homework. So, listen to those quarterly earning reports. And if you find something that maybe that CEO said at a subsequent earnings report, you capture it, and then you include that in an email and say, hey, I would love to follow up with you and talk about how we can help you with this particular initiative that you were talking about last week. So never, try to always be of service to that C-level executive. It's one of my favorite phrases, be of service. So always look for ways to be of service to that C-level executive, and don't stop doing your homework, and don't stop providing that value that's going to keep you in the, provide you that continued access to that C-level executive.
And I don't know if there's any data on this or if there's anecdotal evidence on this, but how likely are you to keep the business if you check in? I hate that word, but you know how I'm describing here. But you check in every 6 months, you add value every 6 months for the foreseeable future. How much stronger does that make your position as the incumbent supplier if you manage to grab that position versus you don't do that and you go off and prospect another 5 accounts and hopefully close one of them? Clearly there's a balance between the two efforts here, but is it always worth that extra homework, that extra check-in every 6 months, that extra sharing of data and insights? Is it always worth doing on these big accounts?
So there's that old saying, if a tree falls in the woods, does it make it, and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? If your company is creating value, but you're not advocating it, is it perceived in your customer organization? So if you're not advocating your value, if you're not selling your value, then you are always going to be at risk when budgets get tight. And unless you're a must-have, and very few of us are must-have solutions out there, you're always at risk of being one of those budget items that's cut. So the important, I think one of the biggest benefits of having that continued access to that senior level executive is your ability to sell the value that you've created. And we always talk about selling value. And the reality is what we're really typically talking about is we're selling perceived value, the value that you could get from our solution. With senior level executives, we're actually selling the value that we've created. And what we're doing is demonstrating to them, when budgets get tight, we're one of those solutions that you're not going to want to cut because of the value that we're creating. So that's, to me, it's absolutely, and as we all know, it's harder. If I'm going to go and prospect with 5 accounts, I'll be lucky if I get into one of those accounts, and I'll be lucky if one of those accounts turns into an actual viable opportunity. It's much easier to keep business than to go out and continually have to go out and create business. So advocating your value is something that every salesperson should be striving to do with their key accounts.
That is something that we've not covered on the show before. Perhaps it's a conversation for a future episode, Jim, but I do this inadvertently, almost by accident, but I need to have a real focus on it and have a think about it of one of the customers that the podcast has. We drive them a load of traffic. We drive them a load of signups to a sales product. And every month I send them a report. I send them some insights of what's going on with my audience, what they are enjoying about the product from the feedback I get, and essentially customer feedback for them. I do a lot of collecting of it, and it's all added extras. I'm not charging them for the emails that I go back and forth on and the kind of questionnaire that I send out every 6 months to the group I know that use their product daily. And it's only with hindsight that that's probably a smart thing to do. I was almost doing it as a way to keep the conversation going. But as you described then, it's less about perhaps staying top of mind. It's more about reinforcing the fact that what you're doing is almost a must-have for them. And I'm saving them a ton of work. Them advertising on the podcast and being involved with our mailing list and doing live events and things like this, I'm saving them hiring 4 or 5 people to do perhaps a better job than what I'm doing, perhaps not a better job than what I'm doing, but I'm reversing risk from them. Hiring people, there's lots of different elements to this, and within the company, I'm dealing with the C-suite there. And it's interesting to just ponder on that for a moment. So perhaps I need to do it, more often than what I'm doing, and perhaps these reports need to be a conversation as opposed to an email that I ping off. So I appreciate that, and I'm going to implement this into the sales strategy moving forward with this account to grow what we're doing together. So I appreciate that, Jim. And with that,
well,
mate,
better yet, send them a Brainshark.
Yeah, even better. You can tell us a little bit more about Brainshark in a second, but before that, I've got one final question to ask everyone that comes on the show, and that is, if you, sir, Jim, could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling?
I would have said to my younger self, you don't have to do all the talking. It took me about 6 months and a good training program to realize that great sellers are the ones who listen. I'm much more comfortable being in the asking questions. This kind of being the interviewee, I guess, is something I'm less comfortable with. So I would tell my younger self, A, you're going to love sales. I originally went into sales reluctantly. And second, listen. Ask questions and then shut up and listen.
How long did it take you to enjoy sales? And I'm asking this from the context that there's plenty of people that listen to this show now because they're looking to up their game. Perhaps they're not getting out of it what they thought that they would financially. So how long do we need to stick with it to really uncover that this might be something that we love, and it might be a career of 10, 20, 30 years versus something that we're just doing in the meantime?
It took me about 9 months. I really struggled my first 6 months in sales because I came out of the product part of our business. I was sold software. And so I knew the product really well. And I made the classic mistake that every salesperson makes, or a lot of salespeople make, which is I just demoed. I went right to the demo and I showed them everything. Isn't this great? Isn't it? You can do this, you can do that, you can do that. And I was struggling and I wasn't selling anything. And I begged my company to send me to a sales training program. It was that Xerox sales training. I actually took it as a customer. And it was an epiphany because it advocated, you have to ask questions, understand what the buyer's needs are, get them to see needs that maybe they don't understand that they have. I was like, oh my gosh, I should be asking questions. Like, what a concept. And it changed everything for me. And so instead of demoing, I'd go in and I'd ask questions about how they were running. It was software to help run magazines. And so I'd ask them, how are you currently doing this? And how are you currently tracking your insertion orders? And then when I did the demo, I only demoed those things that I knew were relevant to them. I didn't have to demo everything. I just demoed. You said that it was important for you to be able to track the rates more carefully. Let me show you how our software can help you do that. And I loved, again, because that's my style. If you meet me at a party, I'm going to ask you a lot of questions. I'm not real comfortable talking about myself. And so that style of selling really worked for me. And I became very successful. And in the second 6 months of my first year as a salesperson, I actually sold more in those first 6 months than the previous 3 salespeople had sold that previous year. And once you start getting that success, there is nothing better. And still to this day, winning a big deal is one of the best feelings I've ever had in business. And hitting your number and getting to go to club and all the things that you set in a goal, you set an objective. There's nothing better in my opinion in business than closing a big deal.
I say this to so my girlfriend's a doctor. I say this to her all the time. There's no bigger. It's almost not even an adrenaline rush. It's almost like a dump of like endorphins and then a dump of whatever hormone is like your relax and release hormone as well, of when I close a deal, versus driving cars fast on a track versus downhill mountain biking, all the stupid stuff I do on the weekend, the kind of clay pigeon shooting, even getting, the 50 clays out of 50 clays and just nailing it. That's not the same as closing, as what we're doing at the moment at the podcast, kind of these decent sized 6-figure deals. There's nothing like that. And so, yeah, it's almost a great point of perhaps you should stick at sales until you have just a little taste of success. And maybe that's what's going to motivate you and drive you further forward. And with that, Jim, wrap up, mate. Tell us a little bit about Brainshark and where we can find it as well.
We're all about sales readiness, and it's a software, a SaaS-based solution that helps a sales enablement leader do three things: create great sales readiness content so their salespeople can learn their products, get onboarded. We deliver that content wherever the salesperson is working, whether that's in Outlook or in CRM, Salesforce.com, on their phone. And then we track whether that salesperson is actually ready to have those conversations using our video assessment and coaching tool. And you can find out more about Brainshark and our sales readiness platform at www.brainshark.com.
Good. I will link to that in the show notes over at salesmanpodcast.com. And with that, Jim, I want to thank you for your time. We'll have you back on to dive into some of these concepts deeper, because I feel like we've done a good overview here, but I feel like we could go for 5 hours diving into each one in particular. And with that, mate, I want to thank you for joining us on the show.
I loved it. It was great. And I look forward to having follow-up conversations with you, Will. Thanks for having me on.